Hey everyone, this is Lola, and this is part 3 of personal safety and injury prevention. Now, I've done part 1 and part 2, so if you'd like to see those, they are in my YouTube channel. So in part 1 and part 2, we covered everything on the left-hand side here. So curriculum, injuries in the body, how can we make sure that there are fewer injuries, and infectious diseases. In this video, we are going to talk about violent behaviors. So here we go with the definition of violence. It's defined as the intentional use of physical force or power, whether it's threatened or actual, and it could be against oneself, another person, or against a group or community. And there are different types of violence. We see psychological violence, emotional violence, physical violence, financial violence, spiritual violence, sexual violence, and bullying. And of course, we're going to talk about each one of these in the next couple of minutes. But before we talk about it, I would like you to take a look at this video. It's on interpersonal violence, and it has a really good explanation of everything. I will have the link in the description box below. So if you can pause it here, show it to the class, and then come back to this, that would be great. So what is psychological violence? It really is when people use these kinds of things that we see against another person. They cause fear in a person in order to gain control. They might use threats or induce fear. There might be taunting, demeaning, witnessing, swearing, threatening, shouting, and degrading. It's really any intentional conduct that seriously impairs another person's psychological integrity through coercion and threats, as we just talked about. Any act which causes psychological harm to an individual. Psychological violence can take on any form, as we see above over here. Emotional violence, on the other hand, is any abuse of power that isn't physical, which may include verbal aggression, intimidation, manipulation, and humiliation, which most often unfolds as a pattern of behavior over time. And that usually aims to diminish another person's sense of identity, their dignity, and self-worth, and which often results in anxiety in the other person, can also lead to depression, suicidal thoughts or behaviors, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. We need to remember that emotional abuse can hurt and cause just as much damage as physical abuse. So what is physical violence? It's probably the one that we can see the most, right? We'll be able to see bruises or something on somebody. So it's any act which causes physical harm as a result of unlawful physical force. Physical violence can take the form of, amongst other things, serious and minor assault, deprivation of liberty, and manslaughter. Physical abuse or physical violence is often the most easily recognized, as we just talked about. Physical violence can be any kind of hitting, shaking, burning, pinching, biting, choking, throwing, and beating. An example might be a father hitting his child every time he thinks the child did something that went against what he thought they should do. Financial violence or abuse happens when somebody controls an individual's financial resources without the person's consent, or they might misuse those resources. And examples of financial violence include not allowing a person to participate in educational programs, controlling the person's choice of occupation, for example, illegally or improperly using a person's money, their assets, and property. Another example is forcing a signature on checks or legal documents. Extortion is a common example of financial violence, and it is the practice of obtaining something through force or threats. So, for example, in a school setting, we would see one individual going and bothering another individual at lunch and forcing that person to give them the money and saying that if you don't give me the money, I'm going to hurt you. Moving on to spiritual violence. So this occurs when someone uses an individual's spiritual beliefs to manipulate them, to dominate them, or control them. Spiritual violence includes not allowing a person to follow his or her preferred spiritual tradition, or degrading one's beliefs and forcing adherence to a belief system. Sexual violence means any sexual act or act targeting a person's sexuality, their gender identity, or gender expression, whether that act is physical or psychological in nature. If it's threatened or attempted against a person without the person's consent. It includes sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, things like indecent exposure, voyeurism, non-consensual condom removing, also known as stealthing, and sexual exploitation. For further clarity, sexual assault includes rape. Sexual violence can occur if one person overpowers another person. That's regardless of age. Sexual abuse or violence is also any type of sexual contact between an adult and anyone younger than 18. So we all know that bullying is a huge thing that goes on in schools. It's really a distinctive pattern of repeatedly and deliberately harming and humiliating others. Specifically, those that are usually smaller or weaker or younger, or in any way more vulnerable than the bully himself or herself. The deliberate targeting of those lesser power is what distinguishes bullying from, garden variety aggression. Bullying can involve verbal attacks, things like name calling and making fun of others, as well as physical ones. Threaten to harm somebody or other forms of intimidation and deliberate exclusion from activities. Studies indicate that bullying peaks around the ages of 11 to 13 and it decreases as children grow older. Overt physical aggression such as kicking, hitting, and shoving is most common among younger children. Relational aggression, damaging or manipulating the relationship of others, such as spreading rumors and social exclusion, is more common as children mature. And most bullying occurs in and around school, as we had mentioned, and on playgrounds, although the internet really lends itself to particularly distressing forms of bullying. It's a 24/7 nightmare. It goes on all day. So back in the day, people would go home and, they wouldn't have social media. And so they wouldn't, have to deal with the bullying until they got to school, which is not a great thing. But at least it ended at some point. But today it's 24/7. Approximately 20% of students report being bullied at school, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. Boys and girls are equally likely to be bullied. So we just talked about this actually in the last little thing about bullying, and this one's on safety and social media. So it's really hard for kids to disconnect from their phones. Teens are constantly trying to attain power on social media, even while they're at school. Unfortunately, your school day does not end when you leave school. You may find out many things on social media, as we talked about. You were not invited to a party, your crush is flirting with someone else, and the bullying has now moved online. Neglect is a form of abuse where the perpetrator, who is responsible for caring for someone who is unable to care for themselves, fails to do so. It can be a result of carelessness, of indifference, or unwillingness and abuse. As we can see here as well, child neglect is a form of child abuse when a parent or caregiver fails to provide for a child's basic needs. This includes the failure to provide adequate supervision, healthcare, clothing or housing, as well as other physical, emotional, social, educational, and safety needs. The truth about family violence. Listen, we know that this happens a lot in society, and we know from a study that just under 760,000 Canadians said that they experienced unhealthy spousal conflict, abuse, or violence in the previous 5 years. So that's quite a few people. It can be difficult to discuss family violence, and it often goes unreported. And people usually kind of stay in that kind of situation because they're scared for themselves and other family members, and it could be emotional or financial dependence on the abuser, or due to feelings of shame or denial. So oftentimes it's a secret. Let's look at the difference between abuse and violence. So abuse is the improper treatment or usage, and violence, on the other hand, is extreme force. The roots of abuse and violence are found in the many types of inequality which exist in society. So we have abuse and violence, which are used to establish and maintain power and control over another person. This can often reflect the imbalance of power between the victim and the abuser. Neglect can also include not calling a physician or not reporting or taking action on a medical condition, injury, or a problem. So let's take a look at violence, and this is a review. So what is violence? Looking at the types of violence. So identify each type of violence and examples of actions or behaviors of this type of violence. So again, going through it: psychological, emotional, physical, financial, spiritual, sexual, bullying, verbal abuse, and neglect. So we'll pause over here so that you can explain all these. Another discussion question: why do you think individuals may exhibit violent behaviors? Responding to violent behaviors. What are some ways that an individual can get help if they are a victim of violent behaviors? Then think about why the individual might not want to get help or why they might be hesitant. So part 3 is going to stop over here, and we'll move on to part 4, which will be dealing with violence. Thanks so much for watching, guys.